ThePrint softcover, where we launch nonfiction books. And today we have a very interesting book with us, which is called The Final Farewell. This is how the book looks like. And it says it's understanding the last rites and rituals of India's major faiths. So today I have with me Minakshi Dewan, who's written this very, very interesting and fascinating book. Minakshi, let's start with this idea because, before this interview, I was thinking that death and aging, these are two things that we usually don't like to explore or talk about a lot. We do see old people. In fact, there's a sense of invisibilizing once you reach a certain age, within families and even in society. I feel like it's only in the last year, even like our entertainment industry has begun focusing on stories and older actors have started getting roles. So, in this space, I felt like this book came out at such an interesting time as well, because I felt like this also complements this sort of finally having a conversation. So I wanted to first start with your opinion on this, because it started with your introduction. I was talking about like it's a personal loss, which started off your journey of writing this book. So if you could tell us a bit about that.
So I think, as you just said, last rites and rituals and death is one topic where there's a lot of silence. People don't want to talk about aging. People don't want to talk about last rites, death. So I think it's very crucial that we start talking about these things. And films and articles and blogs have started bringing this topic up recently. It's a welcome change. But while I started working on this book, it was amidst a raging pandemic, COVID-19, and that's when we saw that the death toll was really high, and last rites came to the center stage. Everyone started talking about the performance of last rites and rituals, how well are they performed or how well they're not performed. The spaces had shrunk, the dearth of death workers. So I think that's when death work started gaining prominence. And even films like Ram Prasad Ki Tervi and Puglet started talking about, they were centered around last rites and rituals. So media and films also started talking about last rites, and that's when I think I conceptualized this book. The idea was conceived, and I thought it's important that we start a discourse around this important topic, which is inevitable. And it's an important part of our existence, and why should we shy away from talking about last rites? These days there is so much discussion around last rites, grief. How do people deal with the grief? What are the mechanisms that are available? I recently wrote a personal piece for this publication. It's called Talk Death, where there are different kinds of articles around death, around last rites, different ways of looking at last rites, different methods that are available. Like in Japan, people are exploring tree burials or tree cremation, as they call it. So it's very interesting. Water cremation is there, aqua cremation, as we also call it. So people are exploring different methods. Even in India, it's just started to, people have started this dialogue around exploring different methods of performing last rites. Or within the broader framework, they're trying to see the greener cremation systems in India also. So I think this dialogue has started, and I think it's a blessing in disguise that pandemic helped us mainstream this idea of last rites and rituals and death work.
Okay. So I'll look at some of the chapters that stood out for me, I think in particular, because probably I hadn't thought of that in the way that you've written about, or maybe even the title of the chapter. So one that basically really stood out is something that we always look at Varanasi or Banaras as like this holy city, and people go. And of course, we know it's common within Hindu parlance that people do go to Varanasi to perform last rites. But like it was the title, which is a site of death tourism, that stood out for me. So because this is the use of this phrase. Could you tell us a bit about how this city, which is considered one of the holiest in India, in fact, how it is a site of death tourism, and when we say death tourism, basically what are we trying to say?
So it was very interesting when I was, how every chapter has a backstory. Right. So I was researching on different aspects around last rites, and when I was studying Varanasi, I came across a scholarly article which talked about dark tourism. So that's when I started exploring and I started looking at, and that article mentioned and spoke about different uh, tours and travel agencies which are looking at organizing these tours in Varanasi. And I started Googling and I got in touch with these people and I asked them if they're keen on getting interviewed and share their experiences around these walks that they organize to fulfill the morbid fascination of different people. And also I think it was very interesting how they spoke about it. They say we will not call it dark tourism, but yes, we want to make people more aware about different ways of performing last rites and rituals. Like, I think open fire cremation is not something which is very common outside India. Cremation per se is, but not in this format, the open fire cremation. So it's something which is very intriguing. Even though they respect, the open fire cremation, but it's still very intriguing for people, a person who's coming from outside, even for a person in India who hasn't seen or has experienced open fire cremation or hasn't been to a crematorium, it would be a new experience, I feel. So I think it's about that, and the things that they cover is also very interesting. The Manikarnika and Harishchandra Ghat, and then they take you to different other sites, and then Aghori Ashram. So all those things are covered, but how they do it is also interesting, and how they break different myths and misnomers around last rites and rituals in India among Hindus is also kind of interesting. Those narratives that I have featured in the book are pretty interesting, and they were quite an eye opener for me as well. When I looked deeper into ethnographic studies, also when I came back from Varanasi, to understand the Aghori rituals and how they are done, what is being done in the ashram. So I think it's very interesting in that sense.
So, I mean, of course, since you've looked at so many different elements of rituals and different communities and faiths, I was wondering if anything that has particularly, surprised or amazed you, because you mentioned so many, even within the book. But, was it at any point in research you thought, okay, this is something I may never have thought of in certain ways?
Uh, I don't think there is anything which things were intriguing, certainly,
Right.
but I wasn't too surprised. Like, I would say, when I was still writing my proposal and I was thinking about toying with this idea of coming out with a book on this topic, I definitely came across Parsi or Zoroastrian last rites and
Right.
rituals, which are very different, and they're very unique in a sense, because they don't bury or cremate their dead because they don't want to pollute these elements, but they leave the bodies at the towers of silence to be devoured by vultures and crows. So it's very unique, it's very interesting, and many people are not aware. Even I wasn't as deeply aware about these aspects and about these rituals until I started researching on the book. Then another aspect which was very intriguing was that among Hindus, we think that everyone is cremated,
Hmm.
but that's not the case.
Hmm.
Uh, Young children under the age of 2 are not cremated, and there's a deeper meaning behind it. Why aren't they cremated? As if one reads that chapter on Hindu last rites and rituals, we'll find literature and discussion around that. And then our sannyasis are not cremated; they are immersed or they are buried depending on the sect that they belong to. So I think these are some things which are very interesting. And then how there are hierarchies around different pandits, and there's a very specific role for a Mahapatra or a Mahabrahmin, and there's a so those things were intriguing, and how last rites and rituals are very even when we are dead, our identity is still very crucial when it comes to last rites and rituals.
I was
So
actually
these
reminded of two different stories in two very different languages that I read, because you mentioned this specific bit about not cremating a child, and both of these stories basically talk about the trauma of burying a child. Like, one is actually not even a child; it's basically an embryo in a certain sense, not fully
Yeah.
developed, and how it haunts the person who buries. And the other is a Chirwa Chebe book, which is, of course, one of the most famous that I studied, and where it's also about how twins, if it's twins, they are buried. So yeah, I mean how, and also that shows there's also this underlying similarity across culture and historical and geographical spaces about these rituals, specifically this that they're very young, or how children are basically cremated. I felt so that really, I mean, that is what I was also thinking in my head when I asked the questions, like because. And also the parts, I feel like there's also a lot of controversy, quote unquote, in the sense people who don't know. I mean, obviously there's a belief system behind it. Whether or not you agree with that belief system is a very different matter. But I know that when people hear it for the first time, they are traumatized. I think sometimes if they don't belong to the communities, like that feels brutal. But of course, there's a way of assimilating with nature in a different way. Like we believe, how cremation assimilates. So yeah, okay. There's one more that I specifically actually wanted to, get my audience to know, because for me, again, it was very fascinating, the chapter, which is last rites among the kinnar, a neglected group. Because I feel like even now, forget last rites, like their identity or, it is so much shrouded in misrepresentation and, this sense of fear of them that people don't ever interact with them the way you would to another human being, actually, in that sense. Like, so I thought we could, I mean, you could tell us a bit, and for the audience, a bit about that particular, the rituals that they follow.
So it's very interesting. I tried getting in touch with some members of the community, uh, but it was obvious that it was very guarded.
Right.
Not only their last rites and rituals, they're very guarded about their rituals per se. Other rituals that the community performs. And so it was very obvious. It wasn't something that came as a surprise to me. So when I approached them, there was and the phone was hung on me. So
Okay.
I knew, I understood that, and I accepted it very well. So then my second resort was to look at the existing literature or newspaper clips which center around these topics, or some ethnographic detailed works around this. And what I came across was very, very interesting. There are two aspects that I highlight in the chapter. One is that their last rites and rituals don't fall under any religious, they don't follow any religious binaries per se. So they are, some of their rituals are very close to the Muslim or the Islamic last rites, like burying, kafan, pehnana, and so these are very close to the Muslim or Islamic last rites and rituals. Reading of verses from Quran, for instance, and some of the last rites and rituals resemble the widow making rituals as they're practiced among Hindu communities. So you see that it's not a very strict religious, or scriptural thing that the community follows. So that was something which stood out for me, because the community is different, and so are their last rites and rituals. But what was another thing which was very interesting for me was that the question that why do some kinners who align more with the Hindu religion, if they want to cremate their dead, will they be permitted to do so? So then I started researching on this, and then I came across the work of Kinnar, this akhada, which is run in which is it's an organization in Varanasi. They are trying to advocate for equality in last rites and rituals. And few years back, they performed a collective pinddan for many kinnars in Varanasi. So that was something also. I thought that there are a certain sects or organizations within the community which are trying to campaign for equality in last rites and rituals. So what stood out for me was that uh, every community member, uh, whichever community, sect, or beyond your sexuality, one should be given right equality in last rites and rituals. I think that's where I end the chapter, because it still might we still might have questions around the last rites and rituals that the community follow. But one thing which stood out for me was the equality that should be given to each and every member of the community to follow the last rites and rituals as per their belief system. Uh, something I think we should look into.
So I'm going to ask about this one other chapter actually in particular, which is because it is one of the movies that I watched very young and had like this massive impact. I'm assuming you've guessed, which is basically Gendered Mourning, Rudali's Mirasan Sunupari. Now, Rudali, of course, is that iconic movie with these two fine actors. And I remember watching it, like I said, very young. I think my mother was watching it. I ended up sitting, and you end up watching the whole.
Yes, it happens.
I remember, like, Amjad Khan lying on his deathbed and all of it. I think for me, if I have to think of it in terms of like, what is the most potent memory related to somebody dying? I think that movie would be it because there were so many things going on. Like from how he's holding on to the tail of this calf because somebody's telling this is how you reach heaven.
Right.
And then you have to call Rudal because there's nobody to cry. I think for me as a kid, my mother trying to explain that there's nobody to cry did not make any sense. How can
Right, right, right,
so
right.
tell us a bit about this, like these three different not sect, I don't know how else to call it actually, how addresses that you've mentioned, and how are they interesting and how they come into this fold of last rites?
So it's very interesting. When I started again researching on the book, I was aware of the Rudali tradition thanks to the film Rudali and Maheshwata Devi's story.
Right.
I had those things in my head, but I watched the film again. As you said, that there were so many things which were going on
Right.
in my head, and I wanted more clarity because as a kid or as a teenager, when you see something, it leaves a different impact on you, and when you looking at it from a different lens, or you need to interpret it, then you look at it very differently. So the literature and the stuff that I came across was that another book, non-fiction book that I came across was something which was very interesting. The book spoke about how these traditions are transitioning in the current times with urbanization and so how they played a very crucial role in this lamenting culture in Rajasthan. When we talk about Rudalis, the Rudalis were invited, and there was a class thing around it, prestige around it. The more women are employed for lamenting, the higher would be the prestige of the thakurs. So
Right.
how it was connected to class, it was connected to caste, because Rudalis came from a certain background,
Mm.
uh, came from a certain class, and how they served another class and another caste. It's very interesting how lamenting is seen as a performance, and but it was there was of course a hierarchy attached to it. It wasn't just seen as a performative aspect. There was also like who would perform and who would not perform.
Right.
So women from higher caste were not it wasn't considered seen too well that they are lamenting and they're crying
Mm.
loudly. So I think another aspect was to call someone from outside to lament for the dead.
Mm.
So, and then while I was still researching on this, I was talking to someone from Punjab, and then someone spoke about the Mirasi community and their women who are called Mirasans, and I wasn't aware of this tradition. Then I saw this film, a documentary film called Mirasans of Punjab, and I ordered. It wasn't available online, so I ordered a copy of the film, and I watched it. And that's when I understood that how there is so much overlap again,
Mm.
again in different one you see in Rajasthan, which is very different from Mirasans in Punjab, because Mirasans played a crucial role not only in lamenting or the death rituals. They played a very important role across the life cycle rituals. They were even invited to the mundans. They also sang ghodis in the weddings. So I think it was very interesting how they became a part of this broader life cycle rituals. So that was the difference, and it stood out for me that, I mean, they were trained not only in lamenting, because lamenting is also performative
Mm. Mm. Mm.
aspect to it, but also singing ghodis, and how they learnt it from their mothers or their grandmothers. It was very interesting. So the film has a very interesting narrative. I mean, I couldn't speak to anyone from Mirasi community or Rudali community, but it was interesting to look at those existing narratives in films and literature. But I could speak to one Opari performer in Tamil Nadu, who also is now, this tradition is transitioning. Many artists are trying to mainstream these folk traditions, these women have started to come and participate in different festivals, which are centered around performance. And they also participate, or they are also acting in the films now, performing the role of an Apari in a film. So I think these things are transitioning. Somewhere they are taking a new shape, and somewhere they are also becoming extinct. So it's very interesting to look at those lamenting, and they're not just unique to India. It happens all around the world, in China and in many other cultures. These women have played an important role. I don't know if the class angle existed there also, but these traditions, they do exist across cultures and across, I think, continents.
Actually, what you said about Marasan and how, I was doing a story and then, somebody was telling me again, I wasn't aware. And that's why I wanted to discuss this chapter because this person said that, if you, like when we think of Punjabi music, there's a certain kind of music we think of. And, when you think of folk music, he said that you have to understand that they had a very, very, important contribution to the development of the folk music of Punjab, and which people obviously forget because, like you said, they're so everywhere in the sense they're such a part that you ignore. It's like, a lot of times women, right? Because, they don't speak up in that sense or all that you forget about their contribution altogether. But he was talking about how massive impact of those songs that you mentioned are on the culture.
And these women, they came from a certain community, and many of them were attached to the royal families
Right.
in Patiala, because, and they were very proud of their patronage, because and the lineage, they came from Baba Mardana's family, who was very close to Guru Nanak Dev. So it's very interesting how they derive a lot of pride from their lineage. Uh, so I think it's very interesting, and performing giddas and performing lemons at the same time is something which is very interesting. So I mean, it was a very interesting question, I thought, Tina.
Right. Also coming back because so far discussion and something that I started off with that there's a lot of silencing around it. In fact, I remember this very particular incident when somebody I know, her dad suddenly passed away when she was not in India, and mom had already passed away. And she's the elder child, and women, as it is, don't have as much access. Like you said, they may be performing it, they may be, crying, and things are like if you're a widow, being performed on you. But when it comes to the legality of it, because since I thought maybe we could talk about that a bit as well, since we're talking about so many things, that when it comes to the legal aspects, from will and all, because we're so scared of like death that people don't even make wills half the time. And she later, I remember that text because it stood out for me because, when I inquired, are you okay and all? She said, Tina, make sure, anybody you know and all, I would definitely from now on advise that, make sure there's a will, there's these things in order, because otherwise, you can't even grieve properly because you're caught in some, legal situation where you're running from pillar to post. So half your brain is on the funeral rites, half your brain is trying to process what to do. So I feel like that silence that we have, the refusal to acknowledge that we are going to die or that anybody can die at any given moment is what leads to this chaos sometimes, I feel. Because, there are elements to it. Of course, there's a rights part of it that may not necessarily be grieving. Even if it helps you process the grief, that's different. And then you have the obviously process of losing somebody, and then there's this grief. And then you have this technical aspect. So I feel like there are so many elements to it that people don't discuss that it becomes an issue when it actually happens. Nobody knows actually. There are too many people coming to give you advice, but even they don't know what to say anymore, I feel.
And there is so much silence around it. B,
Right.
I also feel that there's a lot of ignorance around it.
Right.
Because you are performing so many rituals, but you don't understand the deeper meanings behind those rituals.
Right.
Like for me, when I was performing my dad's Antim Sanskar, and there were so many rituals, I was not aware. I didn't know why was I performing a Pinddan for my dad. Why were we immersing his ashes in Haridwar per se? And why? So the deeper meaning behind these rituals, as you said, the legalities is of course another thing that comes into play once you start. Even when you want to decide whether you want to use a CNG, a system of cremation, or whether you want to use an electrical one, or whether you want to go for an open pyre.
Mm.
One is so confused. One doesn't even know which all systems exist. I wasn't aware till I started researching on the book. And then another aspect is, of course, you don't know where to get the death certificate, because again, the legal things, when you start thinking about those things, these things also have to be done. The documentation
Mm.
has to be done. One is not aware about where to get all the document. Now things have, of course, become more easy with with all these admin things becoming online and stuff, but still one is not aware about that. And also the legal will and all these things which come into play later on, one is not aware of that. So I think it's important that we start the discourse and then start talking about these things as well on the site. So yeah, it's crucial.
Okay, so one last. I had so many questions. I think for me, it was also like a lot of knowledge base in that sense. Like you said, so I'm from Assam, so we have very different set of Hindu
Right,
rituals.
right.
Um, in fact, I remember, like I said, until somebody very close to you passes away, you have no awareness of what's going on. And I remember doing these rituals because everybody else is doing it. When my grandmother passed, but of course, I was also much younger, and
Mm,
I did not know. In ours, there is the concept of feast, like a proper feast,
right, right.
Tevi, which you
Ah,
call.
which is done across,
Yeah, but also interesting because depending on which faith you belong to, for us,
right,
like for example, it's non-vegetarian food and it has to be a specific kind. It
right.
can't be
That's very
anything.
helpful.
Yeah, so there's very specific way of that.
Right,
Then you have on a 7 day, they're different, and then we have a different way of mourning in terms of what you call, right? I
right.
remember very distinctly that we have because it's more Vaishnavism, so you call in these performers. Actually, they are also performers where
Mhm.
it goes on the whole night. Everybody
Mm.
sits and it goes all the whole night. This high intensity performance actually, if you think of it.
It's like a wake,
Yeah,
Uh, yeah,
it
yeah,
was, and I realized like it's not performed even in weddings or any other thing. So actually all of these memories were also coming to me. I think when I was reading the book of when I was thinking, oh, what was my last memory or what was my first memory? Even the food, for example, that you eat, for morning, why and how you eat it. Um,
right.
and not just how why the fasting. Of course, you fast. Everybody knows that, but
Yeah,
why, right? Like what you do and all of that. Yeah. So coming back, because this is where I would want to end, which is women performing the last rites, the Hindu and the Sikh, because I feel like every few years there is usually a story about this even in newspapers where women are, and it's still not quote unquote normal in most places if a woman wishes to cremate, like open fire cremation. And I have heard this discussion a lot growing up, especially with somebody dying, and oh, they only have two daughters, so now it's the son-in-law and the role of the child is completely negated in that sense. And
right.
because I and my sister, we've heard this a lot when we were younger, right? Like, there's no son for this. So
Yeah,
just, I
yeah,
wanted to end like the final question with this, I think.
yeah. It's a very, very interesting question, and Tina, it was very intriguing for me because I was a chief mourner for my dad's Antim
Mm,
Sanskar. So I wanted to understand these changes also from a very sociological perspective. Trying to see, and this book is also about trying to contextualize and contemporize things. How are these changes, even though small
mm,
or big changes? Big changes are not really happening. Mostly makeshift changes are taking place, but I was still very intrigued. So I wrote a long Facebook post asking some friends, or or friends of friends who would be interested in sharing their stories of women performing the last rites for their family members in whichever way. So I received a really overwhelming response from many women friends and friends, and they wanted to share their narrative, and these narratives I've documented in the book. Then I was speaking to one of the social scientists. I was interviewing him, and I asked him, is this are these changes happening across India? And he said, look, these will differ from region. There'll be
mm.
an urban and rural divide when you look at these things, which are of course new,
Right.
because it's not going to be same everywhere, and India is so diverse, in different aspects. So, but it was interesting to see why are these women participating in the last rites, and in which way are they participating. Like, I remember one story, a friend, she shared her story, and she said that her brothers were present, but she still, because she was taking care of her dad, she was her prime caretaker, so she was the one who wanted to perform the last rites. Even the pandit was very forthcoming, and he said, "नहीं नहीं आप आओ, आप करो." So these are also welcome changes, that I see around me. And I thought, even though they're not majority of the women are doing that, but it's still important to document these changes. They might not be structural, they might not be big changes, but it's still very interesting to understand why, and what of the gendered aspect of last rites, and how it is changing, how those equations are changing, and how women are participating, and what are they doing, and what they're not doing, and what are they not allowed to do. And so I think it's very important that we start looking at, and gender is an overarching theme, as you must have seen in the book. Gender and caste, and
Right, yes.
theme that I have looked at in this volume. Also because we want to look at changes, so we need to look at these things when we want to document changes. So
Thank you, Minakshi. This was a really, really, I think, even on a personal level, I think I got to learn so much. I mean, of course, the book does, but also getting more insights into how you conducted your research as well is always something that I'm very interested in. One of the things that I've always loved doing is research and getting to know. And I think, like you said, in the Mirasan thing that happened a few days ago, and I was like, oh my God, I've just heard this. I literally have just heard this, but I've never heard this word before. And then I read, and I'm like, this can't be happening. I've just heard this like 2 weeks ago, probably, somebody saying. And then reading here, and then the other things like the Rodali bringing back memories. So yeah, on a personal level also, very fascinating book. And honestly, thank you for writing this. I'm sure it's very, very helpful for people who have absolutely no idea, and maybe they want to learn, but again, there's no way of knowing, okay, where do I start, So I think this is a great way for a lot of people to take that first step, at least about knowing, if nothing else, even if nothing is happening or you may not have to do anything in the near future. Again, thank you so much for talking to me as well.
thank you, Tina, for having me here, and I really, really enjoyed talking to you. And I hope these conversations don't end here and people start talking about this. As I was speaking in one of my interviews, and I said this book is just the beginning.
Right.
Because this, as you said, in Assam and in the Northeast, things are very different, and they're done very differently. So I'm sure there are more nuances that need to be uncovered and unraveled.
Right.
This book is just a starting point, I would say. And thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And a great starting point, I would say.
Yeah.
Thank you.